The suburban quiet of Blackwood Heights wasn't just a physical silence. It was a testament to the fragile social contract of its residents, a veneer of civility policed by HOA bylaws and the judgmental silence behind closed curtains. Leo, a vintage car restorer who worked from his immaculate garage, respected the visible rules. His lawn was mown, his siding was beige, and his vintage Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500 conversion was kept indoors. The only exception, the invisible line he occasionally crossed, was his passion's unavoidable byproduct, the scent of high-octane racing fuel. Martha Albright, a retired elementary school principal with a platinum bob and the neighborhood's keenest sense of propriety, lived in the meticulously kept colonial next door. To her, the occasional plume of exhaust or the lingering scent of gasoline vapors wasn't a byproduct of honest work. It was a toxic effluvium, an assault on her senses, and most damningly, too loud. The conflict began with a series of escalating passive-aggressive maneuvers. First, it was the anonymous complaint to the HOA about unapproved solvent emissions. Then, it was the deliberate theatrical closing of her windows and subsequent turning on of her industrial-grade air purifier the instant Leo opened his garage door. Leo, a man who preferred a quiet life but possessed a coiled, stubborn pride, ignored the hints. He simply bought a stronger industrial fan to vent the vapors up and away from his property, a maneuver he knew only pushed the problem slightly higher, not solved it. The breaking point arrived on a humid Saturday morning. Leo was draining a rusted fuel tank, a process that necessitated the temporary placement of a bright red, slightly dented 5-gallon fuel can near his driveway, exactly where the air currents were the stillest. Martha was hosting her monthly garden club, an assembly of perfectly coiffed women sipping iced tea. As the distinct, sharp aroma of stale gasoline wafted over her prize-winning hydrangeas, Martha snapped. She marched out, her expensive espadrilles crunching on the gravel, her voice pitched with a theatrical intensity that made the garden club ladies freeze, their teacups hovering near their lips. "Mr. Novick," she stated, her words clipped and precise, "I have tolerated your garage odors for months, but this," she gestured with an arthritic, accusing finger toward the can, "this is an environmental violation. Your gasoline smells too loud. It is a public nuisance, and it is overstepping its welcome into my private airspace." Leo, wiping black grease from his hands with a shop towel, felt a cold, clean wave of clarity wash over his irritation. Too loud. The absurdity of the phrase, the sensory cross-wiring, the sheer arrogance of claiming ownership of the air ignited something deep within him. He straightened, his eyes locking on hers. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He smiled a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Martha," he said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet, "you have made your position perfectly clear. I understand the boundary now." He picked up the can, his movements almost ceremonious, and carried it into the garage. The garden club ladies murmured, thinking Martha had won. They were wrong. Leo wasn't backing down. He was recalibrating the nature of the war. That night, Leo sat in his kitchen, not researching car parts, but scrolling through online forums for brick masonry, custom grill kits, and municipal zoning laws regarding outdoor cooking structures. He had been accused of an aggressive odor crossing an invisible line. His retaliation would be visible, delicious, and entirely legal. End of part 1 beat. Leo prints out a diagram of his property line, then uses a ruler to draw a perfect square on the paper, placing it exactly 1 inch from the existing wooden fence that separates his yard from Martha's. He writes a single, bold word across the center of the square: smokehouse. This act wasn't just planning. It was the declaration of a strategic, irreversible culinary war. Leo moved with a surgical, almost frightening efficiency. The next morning, a dump truck dropped several tons of sand and crushed stone onto his driveway. He had taken 2 weeks off from his restoration work, claiming a major personal project. Martha watched from her kitchen window, a look of simmering suspicion on her face, but she held her fire. She expected a shed, maybe a slightly larger car lift, something that smelled industrial. She was unprepared for the architectural audacity that was about to take shape. Leo did not buy a cheap metal barbecue. He commissioned a local stonemason, a man named Sal who appreciated the subtle theatricality of the request, to build a custom, Spanish-style, wood-burning outdoor hearth and smoker. The key specification, which Leo had painstakingly ensured met all setback codes, being a permanent, non-flammable structure, was its location. A monumental edifice of red brick and slate, positioned precisely 7 inches from Martha's pristine white cedar fence. This gave him the necessary code clearance for the chimney flue, yet placed the structure in her immediate visual and atmospheric purview. The construction phase was a symphony of deliberate, noise-conscious irritation. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a tamper compacting the foundation, the high, continuous whine of a wet-saw cutting fire brick, the low, continuous chatter between Leo and Sal, whose conversation, though entirely innocuous, seemed to carry perfectly through the suburban stillness. Martha, who had relied on the quiet hum of her air conditioning, found herself tormented by the noise, but she was powerless. The permits were filed, signed, and posted on a clean, laminated board near the site. Days bled into a week. The structure rose, a formidable 5-foot-tall block of solid, smoky red masonry, capped with a slightly offset slate chimney. It wasn't just a grill, it was a permanent declaration of atmospheric dominance. Martha made her second mistake by attempting to use the HOA against him. She photocopied the rules and highlighted the section on aesthetic harmony. She accosted Leo as he was troweling mortar. "This monstrosity," she declared, jabbing a finger toward the structure, "violates the aesthetic harmony of the block. It's aggressive." Leo paused, slowly wiping the mortar from his gloves. "Mrs. Albright," he replied evenly, "please note Section 4C on outdoor kitchens and dining structures. It specifies materials and setbacks, all of which I've complied with. Furthermore," he gestured to his own backyard, which was now dominated by the new structure, "I find it aesthetically pleasing. It is designed to host large cuts of meat, slowly smoked over aromatic hardwood, a process, I might add, that tends to create significant, delicious odor. I've invested in a high-quality, high-flow chimney, specifically so the effluvium doesn't linger low to the ground." His eyes held hers for a long, meaningful moment. "You claimed my gasoline smell was too loud." He picked up a split piece of hickory wood. "You are about to learn what a truly voluminous smell is like." The brickwork cured, Sal finished the stainless steel grate installation. The final touch was a custom-made bronze plaque Leo had bolted to the structure's base, the loudest smell. On the day of the christening, Leo didn't start with a simple hot dog. He purchased a 14-pound Packer brisket, a cut of meat infamous for requiring 14 to 18 hours of continuous low and slow smoking. He bought the most aggressively aromatic wood he could find, Texas post oak and applewood. At 4:00 a.m. the next morning, Leo ignited the fire. The initial, acrid, exciting bloom of raw wood smoke, thick and gray, coiled up and over Martha's fence. By 6:00 a.m., the smoke had settled into the pure, sweet, intensely savory perfume of slow-rendering beef fat and smoldering oak. It was a smell that burrowed into curtains, through air conditioning units, and settled permanently into the fabric of the neighborhood. It was the smell of patience, and more importantly, the smell of victory. End of Part 2 beat. Martha, normally an early riser, emerges at 7:00 a.m. in her bathrobe. She stands stock still on her porch. Her expression is not anger, but a profound, sickening comprehension. The delicious, inescapable, and undeniably powerful smell of barbecue has already saturated her porch swing and is seeping into the open kitchen window. She realizes she hasn't just lost a battle. She has been outmaneuvered in a permanent, daily olfactory siege. She watches Leo, standing by his new structure, casually sipping coffee. He raises his mug to her in a silent, perfectly polite salute of defiance. The olfactory siege began in earnest. Leo, a master of planning and efficiency, did not let the barbecue cool down. He established a relentless smoking schedule. Monday was pork shoulder for pulled pork, a full 12-hour smoke. Wednesday was spare ribs, 6 hours of sweet, smoky heat. And every weekend, without fail, was an enormous brisket or a whole pork belly rendered to bacon, its smoke plume a beacon of savory spite. He even began subtly timing his smoke sessions to coincide with Martha's social calendar. The thickest smoke always seemed to rise just as the garden club arrived, or precisely during the hours she used her backyard patio for reading. The smell, which was undeniably heavenly to a hungry person, became a suffocating torture device to Martha. Her house began to smell subtly of smoke, a persistent, delicious ghost that clung to the upholstery and the carefully arranged potpourri. She tried everything. She closed her windows. She sealed the gaps with painter's tape. She bought a stronger air purifier. None of it worked against the sheer volume and persistence of the high-quality wood smoke. Martha, however, was not one to concede defeat. She was a woman who had run a high school for 30 years. She understood power dynamics and the manipulation of community sentiment. She realized she couldn't fight the smell, so she decided to fight the smoke. Her counterstrike was an inspired piece of calculated pettiness. She filed a new, highly specific and technically correct complaint. Violation of property line air quality for airborne particulates, smoke, and ash. The HOA, nervous about the escalating feud, sent an inspector. The inspector, a hapless man named Gary who just wanted to get back to his desk, found no violation of the fire code or setback. But Martha didn't stop there. The next day, two massive industrial-grade fans appeared on her side of the fence, aimed directly at Leo's backyard. These weren't subtle oscillating fans. They were the kind used on construction sites, mounted on heavy rolling stands. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. When Leo fired up his smoker, Martha would turn on the fans. The wind generated by the fans would create a vortex, preventing the smoke from rising naturally up the chimney and instead forcing a low, swirling cloud of ash and smoke back into Leo's yard. The idea was to smother him with his own weapon, to make his own backyard unusable. The first test was a disaster for Leo. He had a magnificent beef short rib on the smoker. Martha, watching through the blinds, flicked the switch. The fans roared to life, generating an unbelievable noise and an artificial windstorm. The beautiful white smoke, halfway up the chimney, was suddenly ripped downward and outward, swirling into a choking, acrid, low-lying fog that coated Leo's patio table in fine gray ash. He scrambled to shield the smoker, coughing and swearing. He had to shut down the fire and abort the cook, the raw ribs a bitter, smoky reminder of his humiliation. Leo realized the stakes had changed. This wasn't a petty odor dispute anymore, it was an escalating engineering duel. He had built a fortress. Martha had found its atmospheric Achilles heel. He had to neutralize the fans. He spent the next 2 days building a 7-foot-tall, non-flammable, freestanding steel windbreak shield on heavy casters, placing it on his side of the fence, directly opposite Martha's fans. It was ugly, industrial, and completely effective. The next time Martha flicked the fan switch, the powerful blast of air was harmlessly deflected up and over the chimney, creating a smooth, uninterrupted current for the smoke to escape. The only result was an unholy amount of fan noise, and the undeterred, persistent, heavenly smell of Leo's freshly smoked pulled pork. End of Part 3 beat. Martha, standing triumphantly by her roaring fans, watches the thick, savory smoke plume majestically over the top of Leo's new steel shield and directly into the clear blue sky above her yard. The realization that her expensive, noise-polluting defense has been neutralized by a simple, ugly sheet of steel is a crushing blow. She stares at the fan's switch, defeated. Meanwhile, Leo, calmly basting his pork shoulder, picks up his phone and places a new order for aromatherapy-grade hickory smoking chips, the most intense, long-lasting scent he can find. The war wasn't about the smell being loud. It was about the smell being constant. The stalemate settled into a bizarre, tense routine. Martha's fans remained a monument to her failed aggression, their occasional low hum serving as a warning. Leo's smoker, the loudest smell, was an architectural middle finger, relentlessly churning out aromatic smoke. The neighborhood, initially amused, began to take sides, or at least started inviting themselves over to Leo's for samples. The smell was so pervasive that even the most neutral neighbors, unable to avoid the savory perfume, started feeling a craving for barbecue that often led them to Leo's fence. Martha, now isolated and consumed by her righteous indignation, doubled down on the one thing she could control, the property line itself. She hired a surveyor who confirmed the boundaries, then proceeded to have a new fence built. This wasn't the usual cedar. It was a towering 8-foot-tall, solid vinyl acoustic barrier fence, the kind used to buffer highway noise. It was stark white, utterly devoid of charm, and specifically designed to block noise and sightlines, and she hoped contain the smoke. The fence went up in 3 days, completely obscuring Leo's smoker and creating a sterile, noise-dampening wall between the properties. Martha considered it her final victory, out of sight, out of mind, and hopefully out of smell. But the fence, a final, concrete act of separation, only intensified Leo's resolve. He couldn't see Martha's yard, and she couldn't see his. It was the perfect scenario for escalation. He couldn't be accused of direct malice if he didn't know exactly when she was outside. Leo didn't dismantle the smoker. He modified it. He ordered a custom stainless steel extension for the chimney, raising the flue another 5 feet, now an imposing, slender stack that peaked well above Martha's new 8-foot barrier. He had noticed a pattern. High-pressure weather systems created a downdraft that pushed the smoke low. Low-pressure systems carried the smoke high and far. He started consulting local meteorology data before every cook. He didn't just plan a smoke session, he planned an olfactory trajectory. He saved his most potent smoking chips, mesquite, notoriously acrid and penetrating, for days with specific, predictable wind patterns that would carry the smoke not just over the fence, but into her second-story bedroom windows. The retaliation was no longer about gasoline. It was a precise, calculated campaign of atmospheric revenge. The high-rising mesquite-lace smoke plume was now carried directly over the barrier, and thanks to the wind, swirled down onto Martha's master bedroom suite. She woke up smelling like she had slept in a Texas smokehouse. Her clean laundry on the line smelled like the deepest, most savory pork rub. One evening, after 3 days of relentless, intentional mesquite smoke that had permeated the very grout of her bathroom tile, Martha lost her composure. She grabbed a hose, and without opening her gate, began spraying a furious, high-pressure stream of water over the top of the new fence, blindly aiming for the chimney. The hose reached just high enough to cause a dramatic, hissing steam cloud to erupt from the hot steel flue. The sight was absurd. A woman trying to extinguish a slow-burning feud with a garden hose, blinded by a white wall of her own making. Leo, standing calmly below the chimney, watched the water arch over the fence and rain down uselessly. He didn't shout. He didn't even move. When the hose retracted, he simply walked to the speaker he'd quietly installed next to the smoker and turned on a playlist of blues music, the soulful, slow rhythm of the guitar seeming to mock the frantic silence on the other side of the acoustic barrier. He was comfortable. He was winning. But the steam had one unintended consequence. It hadn't extinguished the fire, but it had loosened the mortar around the base of the chimney extension. The heavy steel was now slightly askew, a detail Leo missed in his smug satisfaction. End of part 4 beat. Martha, shaking with frustration, stands on her deck, clutching the hose. She catches her reflection in the glass door. Her hair is mussed. Her face is streaked with a fine dusting of gray ash, and she looks haunted. She realizes the barrier only protected her from the sight, not the smell, and has merely allowed Leo to escalate with impunity. As she stares up at the tall, black steel chimney extension rising above her pristine white fence like a grim sentinel, a sudden, powerful gust of wind hits. The slightly loosened stainless steel chimney creaks loudly against the mortar and leans precariously toward her yard. She takes a single, involuntary step backward, the sheer, terrifying weight of the looming structure, a sudden and unexpected threat. The precarious lean of the steel chimney was more than a technical flaw. It was a physical manifestation of the entire conflict's instability. Leo, high on his victory, was oblivious to the danger. He had loaded the smoker with a whole lamb shoulder, a 16-hour commitment, and had gone to bed, trusting the structure to hold. Martha, however, had seen the lean. Driven by a desperate cocktail of fear and malice, she stayed up all night. She couldn't call the police or the fire department. The structure was still on Leo's property. She knew with chilling clarity that if she couldn't stop the smell, she would have to stop the smoker itself. In the darkest part of the pre-dawn, she executed her final, dangerous plan. She retrieved a coil of thin, high-strength aircraft cable from her shed, typically used for landscaping. Moving with surprising agility for her age, she climbed onto a stepladder set against the inside of her high acoustic fence. Reaching over the top, she hooked one end of the cable onto the decorative wrought-iron flue cap atop Leo's chimney extension. She then climbed down, secured the other end to the sturdy base of her industrial fan, and tensioned the line. It was a crude, silent, almost invisible tripwire. She was daring the elements and the weight of the chimney itself to do her dirty work. At 5:30 a.m., the rising sun brought a sudden, violent thermal updraft, a natural burst of wind that often occurs before the air stabilizes. The wind hit the exposed side of the tall steel chimney, which was already leaning. The torque applied an intense force against the already loosened mortar joint. The final pressure came from the taut aircraft cable. There was a horrible, grinding screech, followed by a low, heavy crumph of falling stone. The custom steel extension snapped at the weak mortar joint, pulled down by the cable and the wind. It didn't fall onto Leo's yard. It was pulled by Martha's taut cable onto her side of the fence, smashing into the concrete deck of her back patio and creating a massive, splintering crack in the slab. The live fire in the brick smoker, deprived of its chimney, immediately turned to thick, choking, black-gray smoke, pouring out of the open base and pooling low across the ground. A scene of total atmospheric chaos. Leo bolted awake to the sound of the crash. He ran outside to find the wreckage, the lamb still smoking in the pit, and the immediate, unmistakable sight of the aircraft cable leading from his ruined chimney straight over the fence to Martha's fan. He stared at the evidence, his victory turning to ash in his mouth. Martha had tried to sabotage his property, and she had succeeded, but the debris landed on her property, damaging her own expensive deck. He walked to the acoustic fence and found the small access gate. He opened it and walked onto her property, standing on the edge of the newly cracked patio, looking down at the ruined structure and the cable. Martha was already there, standing over the wreckage, her face pale, her hands trembling. All her careful composure had vanished. She looked like a woman who had just realized she stepped on a landmine that blew up in her own face. "The structural integrity failed," Leo stated, his voice flat. He didn't ask, he was making an official observation. Martha didn't offer a denial. The sight of her cracked patio, the realization of the massive liability, broke her. The truth, for the first time in months, was less painful than the endless, escalating war. "I called the HOA on your first gasoline smell," she whispered, her voice reedy and thin. "I knew it was legal, I just wanted you to stop. My husband. He died in a garage fire 10 years ago, a small 5-gallon can right by the door, the smell. It just brings it all back. I didn't hate the car, Leo. I hated the smell." She swallowed, tears finally tracking paths through the ash on her face. "And I was afraid of the fire in your smoker. I was afraid of all the fire." The admission hung in the smoky air, a sudden, unexpected, and utterly human twist. Leo's anger, so hot and righteous a moment before, evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening guilt. He had leveraged another person's hidden trauma for a petty act of revenge. His victory had been a monstrous cruelty. The barbecue, built as a symbolic, loud smell, had become a real, tangible danger, a danger she, in her own misguided terror, had ensured landed on her head. End of Part 5 beat. Leo looks from the snapped chimney piece lying on Martha's cracked patio to her tear-streaked face. He doesn't say a word. He turns and walks back to his side of the fence. He doesn't clean up the mess or assess the damage. He walks straight to his beautiful, untouched vintage Mustang, opens the fuel cap, and removes the entire engine. He doesn't need to say anything. The quiet, final sound of tools clattering in the garage, signifying the immediate and permanent end of the gasoline-based hobby, is a far more powerful and devastating apology than any words could be. The delicious smell of lamb and the acrid smell of failure now mix in the air, the true smell of consequence.